Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Jim. First and foremost, thank you, Mark, for your introduction, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Thank you, Sirion, for your introduction, and also, Minister, for your speech. I know you may have to leave midway through what I'm going to say, so I'm going to say the message now in case you leave before, because part of it's for you, which is, I'll give you the summary of the talk, and everyone else can put your fingers in your ears. But the summary is that individualized approaches to dealing with the diabetes epidemic might widen inequalities if they're not done right. And they will have a place, but they are not the solution. And if we're to take the point that Jeff made seriously, which is that, that diabetes is a medical manifestation of a pathophysiological problem, it's also a public health manifestation of a societal problem. And we cannot rely on the same evidence train to get to that point of what works. So if you ask people what works, what's going to do it, they'll say we don't know. And that's because we need a different evidential process. And what it requires is bold action and then evaluation. And so it's very gratifying in your introduction to hear you say the things you said about some of the bold actions that you're willing to take. And if I don't get to the bit of the talk about the food industry before you leave, I think whilst going along with trying to get voluntary reformulation, if you don't hold that potential stick of regulation, I would say nothing's going to happen. So very much support what you had to say. Sorry, you can... Yeah. No, please stay. What I also wanted to say, Jeff and I and others, and Shariki, who's chaired the group who've been doing the review, it is always a privilege to come to another country and see the research that's being undertaken. And we have learnt a lot by being here. We have only, I think, reflected back to you some thoughts of ours. I don't know if they're wise or not, but it is very honour to have been part of the evaluation of the Healthier Lives programme, which I think is of fundamental importance to New Zealand science. So as was said, I'm a clinician who works in the Institute of Metabolic Science, so I care for people with diabetes. I also have a big programme and a big unit trying to understand why some people get diabetes and some don't. But I also think that I would be negligent in my career if I didn't take a step back and say, well, what are we going to do about it? So I have a very big program of research saying, what are the likely solutions to this problem? And the essence of what I want to talk about to you today is where should we be intervening? And these are not alternatives, but it's a question of balance. So we could intervene at the population, trying to stop people progressing from normality through pre-diabetes to undiagnosed diabetes to diagnosed diabetes. We could take a sort of screening approach and try and find type 2 diabetes early and treat it early. We could take a high-risk approach and try and find people at high risk and intervene and stop them progressing from pre-diabetes to undiagnosed diabetes. The question is which? Now, you'll go to some talks in the world and some people will say, I have the answer, it should be this or that. They're all wrong, right? It's a question of balance. So, and I want to stress to you today that we haven't quite got the balance right. So in terms of screening, that first bit, should we be finding people who have diabetes today but don't know about it? And it seems self-evident that we should, because this is a paper I wrote many years ago about should we screen for diabetes, evaluate it against certain criteria. And diabetes fulfills all of those criteria except one, which is, do we have definitive evidence that by finding the disease early in a preclinical phase before diagnosis, that people benefit in the long term? Now, it's self-evident to everybody that that's the case, but there has never been a randomised controlled trial that's tested that, and there will never be, because it would be unethical to find people who've got prevalent undiagnosed diabetes and not tell half and tell the other half. That would be a difficult trial to get through. So we have to rely on different forms of evidence. So we have done a randomized controlled trial of different intensities of therapy from the point of diagnosis. And that's the two lines you can see at the bottom. And this y-axis here is the cumulative incidence of cardiovascular events. What that means is how many people went on to have a heart attack or a stroke over time, and this time going this way. And the red line is routine care, and the blue line is intensive treatment. And you can see that finding people with prevalent but undiagnosed diabetes and throwing the book at them makes a small bit of difference, but not much. Now, what we'd like to say, what's the effectiveness of screening? What's the effectiveness of bringing forward that point of diagnosis? And you can't directly observe that, but you can model it. And that's what we did here. And this is what a 3-year delay in instituting routine care would give you, much higher risk, or a 5-year or a 6-year risk in purple. And what this suggests is there definitely are benefits of screening, but they're probably relatively small. And certainly in our country, they are greater than the benefits of trying to intensify treatment at the point of diagnosis. And that's probably because care for most people in England, this is a trial in England, the Netherlands, and in Denmark, where care is on the whole pretty good. It may be different in other places. So what about the closest you can do to a randomized controlled trial of screening? So we did a trial where we went to practices, used a risk score to predict who had diabetes, and then in a randomized controlled trial, some of them we actually went on to find who had diabetes, and some of them we left alone. So this is a randomized controlled trial of screening at the population level. And you can see the red is the control, the blue is the screening, this is the cumulative probability of death. There is no difference. Now that doesn't mean that the people who've been screened and found to have diabetes haven't benefited. What it means is they're only a small proportion of that total population, and so that effect is small. So what my conclusion is that screening probably is beneficial, but don't expect it to have a major public health effect, because you can't really see it in this trial. Now, research only gets you so far, and then you need politics, and then you need political decisive action. And some people argued about this, but our then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, actually just announced one day that we're going to have a free NHS check, which I don't think is too different to what you have here in terms of a cardiovascular screening. And we have actually just published today, of all days, this paper in PLOS Medicine about an evaluation of that. And because this hasn't been subjected to a trial either, you just evaluate it. But it looks like it's increasing quality-adjusted life years by 3.8 days per head of population, and increasing survival by 3.3 days. Now, whether you think that's big or small is a matter of judgment. It's not very big, but it's not so different to other screening programs, actually. So screening is important, but it may not be the answer. A really important thing here is that the way this is being delivered in England means that local areas have the potential to target particular subgroups. And they are intrinsically targeting people from lower socioeconomic groups, such that the current program actually has a greater absolute impact on health on those living in the most deprived areas. And that's quite unusual. So this is actually reducing inequities, but the size of the effect is quite small. Now, this is an important consideration, because when we did this study in Ely, which is just north of Cambridge, 4.5% of the population had prevalent but undiagnosed diabetes. But actually, nearly 17% of them had a form of pre-diabetes. So the question is, what do we do for those people? Now, they're obviously detectable, but is it worth detecting? So we know from major and really excellent trials in the United States that if you randomize people with that pre-diabetes to placebo in red or lifestyle in blue, and then look at the cumulative probability of going on to get diabetes, it's halved. So under ideal circumstances, lifestyle interventions, diet and physical activity, halve the risk of progression to diabetes. Excellent news. So in terms of taking that evidence, our head of our NHS, Simon Stevens, said, right, let's institute this in England. Now, that's important because he's also on record as saying, which is true that 10% of our budget is spent on diabetes care. Now, what I want to counsel against is expectation, because he said, and by doing prevention, doing nothing as an option, preventing type 2 diabetes is very important, and it'll help reduce costs. And whilst that might be true in the long term, it is categorically not true in the short term, and I'll show you why. So each year we look at 3 million people who are eligible. About half of them turn up for a check. The number who are deemed to be a sufficient risk to have a test of diabetes is 600,000. And of those, about 129,000 would be at a level of pre-diabetes to warrant having an intervention. That's a lot of people. But by doing that, you also find 29,000 people who had diabetes but didn't know about it. Now, they are new patients going into primary care, which is already struggling. So then that's not going to be a reduction in cost. It might be good for health in the long term, as I've said, but short term there's going to be increased costs. Now, what about these people, the 129,000? Well, we were estimating about a 40% uptake into this intervention, and that it would reduce risk by about 26%. Now, that means that there are 81,000 people who've got this pre-diabetes, don't want to come to this intervention, and are going to their GPs on top of the 30-something thousand who've got diabetes. So that's a lot of people swamping the system. The other challenge is a technical thing about risk. Because if the risk you actually introduce people in is high, then you might reduce with this intervention, a lifestyle intervention, about 4,000 cases, but it might be as low as 2,500 if they were at lower risk. Now, over a 10-year period, but you've got a short-term increase in all those patients coming into the system. So it's a very long-term strategy. I think it will work, but it's not the answer. One of the problems is that what happens when you institute a big program is that you go from what is known in trials and you roll it out into the real world, and everybody says, but we've got a lot of people who need this, so let's enroll everyone we can. And that means it gets too big, and you enroll people who are low risk. And if you do that, it's a technical thing. These are different levels of risk, and this is the cost of the likelihood of something being cost effective. And essentially, the more low-risk people you introduce into these type of programs, the much less likely it is to be cost-effective. The other tendency is to try and dilute the intensity of the intervention, which reduces its effect. So there's a big issue about rollout of these types of interventions when you come to the real world. So we need to make a distinction. A randomized controlled trial, like the one I showed you, tells you about efficacy, which is, does this work under ideal circumstances? But what we want to know, living in the real world, is effectiveness. Does it work on average in the real world? And the gap between those two things, which I really like this term, is achievable benefit, not achieved. You could achieve it, but it's not being achieved. And this is the gap, okay? And it is very large. So I'm going to show you some data from the United States. A trial called the VA Move, which compared the risk of going on to get diabetes of people who participated in an intervention compared to didn't. And they had a 20% reduction in risk of going on to get diabetes. Sounds good. If those people engaged in this program in an intense and sustained way, there was a 33% reduction in risk. Sounds excellent. The authors of this paper concluded it's obviously effective. Okay, it's effective for these people who did this, but what about the population? Well, they looked at 1.8 million people. Only 13% of them did it at all, and only 1% of the people did it in an intense and sustained way. So when you say, is it effective? It's effective for those 1% a bit, but what about everybody else? And we've got to worry about the population. So that's why I want to close in talking about an alternative and complementary strategy, which was put forward by someone who taught me called Jeffrey Rose, who said, when we're dealing with issues like diabetes, which are societal problems, which are driven by behaviours which are shared and are collective, like diet and physical activity, let's concentrate only on finding people at high risk. Let's try and shift the whole distribution to the left. So when we talk about individual level diabetes interventions, we talk about 5 things we want to change. That's your level of obesity, physical activity, how much fibre you eat, how much saturated fat, and how much total fat. And in the trials, if you achieve 4 or 5 of those success scores, nobody gets diabetes. And that's also true in the general population. In our studies in lower risk people, if you achieve all 5 of those behavioural scores, nobody goes on to get diabetes. So what is important for high-risk people is the same for the whole population. So why are we thinking of diabetes risk only being some people and not everybody? We are all at risk because we all share the wider environment in which we live. So this is marginally technical, but if you compare, this is a high-risk approach. And people, this is the risk of going on to get diabetes. It's 32 per 1,000. It's very high. And this sort of intervention, if you focused in on people who are sedentary, obese, and had a family history or over 55, that would find high-risk people. But this number here, this is a measure of how much of the diabetes epidemic would be affected. And it's tiny. If you could do something at the other end that affected everybody who was sedentary, just by things that I'll talk about in a minute, the risk is much lower. But because the risk reduction is shared by everybody, in total, the impact on the diabetes epidemic is 9 times as great. So really the only way we're going to deal with this diabetes epidemic is recognizing that it's a societal problem and treating it like one. So that means we have to do different research. We have to move away from thinking that the way we eat, the way we are physically active is a matter of our attitudes and preferences, a personal choice. And I would say we also have to avoid words like lifestyle, because that intrinsically is saying it's a choice, it's a lifestyle. It's not. It's a behavior that's driven by other things, by the layout of our schools, by our workplaces, by the macro wider environment and policy. And we need to do research that tackles that and try and think about what is the research base for shifting this distribution to the left. Now, it's a shame the minister's had to leave, but I'm sure someone can tell him that if you contrast population and high-risk approaches, you also need to contrast what we call low agency and high agency interventions. And what agency is if you had a population approach, you could, for example, not in this context, but you could put fluoride in tap water. That's a population approach, and it's got low agency. You don't have to engage in it, because everybody drinks the water from the tap. But front-of-pack nutrition labelling, it affects everybody, because we all can look at the things, but whether it has any impact on you requires you to do something, and that's called a high agency. And in general, high agency interventions widen inequalities. So what we need to be looking for is these low agency interventions, things we can do for everybody without them having to think about it. Now this brings us to the end, to this problem of the nature of evidence. And I want to share with you a comment that was made in a book chapter that I reviewed in the United States about prevention. So they said, and Shariki, I'm not getting it, all Americans. So they said, we'll review and discuss randomized controlled trials of prevention using behavioral or drugs. We don't consider non-randomized things. And reducing average BMI, that's obesity, or increasing activity in a population would be expected to reduce the incidence of diabetes and actually might benefit more people than high-risk approaches. Unfortunately, testing this hypothesis is exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, and we are aware of no direct evidence to inform public policy. Now, I'm leading a Lancet Global Commission on Diabetes. I have to say that is a recipe for inaction, inertia, and doing nothing. And so we have to say no to that sort of statement. And the problem is that we've been schooled in a way of thinking about evidence, where we do develop something, we do a pilot trial, we do a trial, we synthesize the evidence, and then we talk to a minister and say you should take action. But when we're talking about public health, what we need is evidence, we need action on the basis of best available evidence, because we can't randomize Auckland to be more active than Wellington. You have to do things in a non-randomized way. And what you need is action early. You need action on the basis of best available evidence and then evaluation. And that requires somebody to be bold, because the type of research we want is about how do we change this environment. And this environment is impacting on our diets and our obesity levels. So we measured people who were moving between home and work in a big study and looked at their environmental exposure to takeaways. And you can see this is the difference in body mass index. People who are exposed to lots of takeaways between home and work are fatter. And takeaways expand in areas of socioeconomic deprivation. They're targeted by companies. So what can we do? We can map those, and then we can talk to policymakers, and we managed to support a local authority in Britain in stopping McDonald's putting a takeaway near a school. And so it's that evidence coupled with action that we're looking for. What about sugar-sweetened beverages? So we know that in our work that if you have an average of 1 Coke per day, more than somebody has none, that the risk of diabetes goes up by 25%. So what do you do about it? What you do is, like I did, you put all the evidence together, go towards the Parliamentary House of Commons Select Committee, and actually at the time nothing happened. But a few years later, George Osborne, who was then the Treasurer, announced that we're going to have a sugar levy in Britain. And this is a right-wing government. So we can change what politicians do. And our sugar levy starts in April, and we are evaluating it. It's a sugar levy rather than a tax, and maybe we'll come back to it in the questioning if you want to know the difference. But it's a very complex thing, because we don't know how the companies are going to behave. I said we couldn't randomize Auckland and Wellington to be different in terms of physical activity, but we can have natural experiments where we invest in cycling infrastructure in different places. And we have done that and shown that in intervention towns, the rates of cycling go up compared to comparisons. And we've also evaluated the health effects of things like the bicycle sharing scheme in London, to go from observing impact on physical activity to say, what is the impact on health? So what I'm trying to get at is it is possible to do research. It is possible to produce evidence. But in the end, if we're to do anything meaningful about diabetes and shift this distribution, in the same way that we had politicians and the head of our NHS thinking about screening and early detection and high-risk approaches, somebody, like your minister, is going to have to be bold and take some action. And I'd urge you to encourage him to do that. So I want to close by echoing what Jeff said. It's uncanny, but for me, diabetes, when I'm in a clinic, is a clinical manifestation of a pathophysiological problem. But when I've got my public health hat on, it's a public health manifestation of a societal problem. And the societal problem is one of unsustained behavior change. It's unsustainable. And attempting to deal with a societal problem by treating it like a clinical one will be resource intense. You have 25% of your population with prediabetes. Can you really afford to treat all of those as patients? And I would say it's going to be, if it was the only approach, it will ultimately be unsuccessful. And what you need is bold political action based on best available evidence, followed by robust evaluation. Thank you.